If there is a fast food restaurant that I love going to, that restaurant is Chipotle. The next level Mexican restaurant that tries to dominate the battle for best Mexican restaurant in the United States against Taco Bell, Moe's, and the local chain close to my alma mater, Salsaritas. None of them compare to Chipotle, especially Salsaritas. I love Chipotle. I go about once a week. I order the bowl and a tortilla on the side, sometimes the small ones to vary it a little. I walk through the line getting my servings of brown rice, black beans, sofritas, and veggies, before getting to the end where I get pico de gallo, corn, and wait for the attendant to say, guac or no guac. She's talking about that delicious, nutritious blend of ingredients that make guacamole. Avocado, lime juice, cilantro, red onion, and just the right amount of jalapenos. I say yes, and prepare my taste buds for the most exquisite part of the meal. But as the attendant pours it on my bowl, I notice that the portion she places in the person before me is larger. In just this, right before my eyes, same restaurant, same amount of money, different amount of guac. Injustice of the culinary kind. Today on Disruptive Adventism, we talk about injustice and our role in ministering with the least of these with Nathan Brown, book editor of Science Publishing and author of the book The Least of These, the Sabbath School quarterly that all Adventist people are studying during these 3 months. But before we get to more Chipotle injustices, let's get to know what has motivated him to write, advocate, and love The Least of These.
Every story has many starting points, and I guess I grew up going to church from as early as I can remember. My dad was a pastor, so we were at church every time the door was unlocked, and that was just a part of our family life, and perhaps more than many others, was dominated by church, by the things, by a focus on God and His calling for us. But it was actually when I was at high school, and I went to a public high school, and we had this street preacher guy come to our high school and was as part of the chaplaincy program that the school ran. And the guy brought with him this pretty mediocre cover band who did a cover version of, and this is dating me very much, so back in the late 80s, one of the big songs was U2 Still Haven't Found What I'm Looking For, and I discovered U2's music through that process. And by becoming a fan of their music, I actually started then reading up about things that they were involved with, and reading the works of Martin Luther King and the civil rights history, and then got involved with the work of Amnesty International and some of the other causes that back in the late 80s and into the 90s that U2 was talking about. But that just opened up a whole other world of once you start reading these things, and then there's the next step in that process. And so I've been a long time supporter and involved with Amnesty International, doing those boring letter writing campaigns for many years. But with the understanding that this actually makes a real difference can make a real difference in someone's life. And of course, reading Martin Luther King and then other people connected with him, both people that contributed to his thinking, but then he contributed to other people's thinking, and so you have that whole web of a theology of doing justice and being a voice for justice in the world. And that gave me, in some senses, that was a conversion experience to give me a way of making my faith real, not just something I inherited, but something that made a difference in my life, that gave me a sense of purpose and direction, but also, is faith that actually matters in the world, that makes a difference in the lives of people who most need a difference made in their lives.
Faith that actually matters. Matters to who, you may be thinking. We'll get to that in a little bit for another Chipotle story. But first, let's answer the question, why? Why is it necessary to have a faith that actually matters?
The first thing is that the Bible says so. Even, in so many different ways and places, the Bible gives us this mandate that people of God should be people who are passionate about the needs of others, and particularly those that society often neglects or doesn't listen to, or somehow are outsiders or disadvantaged. That's a significant and recurring theme within the Bible. So I think that's, as a person of faith, that's a pretty important place to start. I think that it also, and partly that's a reflection of the fact that this is something that God is particularly concerned about in the world, and if we claim to follow him, then we're going to have a pretty strong focus on that as well. But then there's simply the personal stories and the idea that in connecting with other people and their stories, how can we ignore their situations and the challenges that life throws at many of us at different times? And when we have resources, whether that's financial, whether that's a voice, whether that's other physical means, whatever that might mean, we should be looking to share them, to use them for the good of others.
After the break, we get to hear a story about how to share those means and how to affect others for the better. Thank you for listening to Disruptive Adventism and our episode on injustice. We'll be right back. This podcast is brought to you by our supporters on patreon.com and coffee.com. Our supporters are the backbone of the podcast, and we are very thankful for all of you. Your contributions allow us to seek the best ideas and disruptors in the world and bring you podcasts that energize, transform, and change your community. We hope you take courage and join our one-time contributors through coffee.com or our monthly ones on patreon.com. You'll get amazing merch and early access to our unedited interviews and produced podcasts. If you want to contribute, hit the links in the description below. And thank you. Thank you for listening to Disruptive Adventism. If you want to get the unedited conversation with Nathan Brown, head to patreon.com/disruptiveadventism. As we continue with our understanding of injustice, let me share a story of financial injustice. I walk into Chipotle, and among the people sitting on the back, there's a gentleman. His name is Scott. As I tie my shoelaces, he asks me for $1. Scott is homeless. I, being a good millennial, don't have any cash on me. So I ask him if I can buy him a meal instead. He nods and agrees. We get in line and go through it. I get my usual fix and he gets barbacoa tacos. I decide to ask him to sit with me. I want to get to know him a little better. He tells me about his story and the difficulties he's facing. He's from California, now in Georgia, homeless, no family, far, far away from where he's from. At the end of our meal, he says to me, "Can you spare a few dollars in cash for me? We can go to the ATM." I struggle to find a reason as to why not, but decide at the end that I'm not so comfortable to give actual dollars to a stranger. Who knows if I enable him to do something worse? Or not? I return and ask the question to myself, who cares if I enable him? That was not my decision. That was his. Wasn't helping what he asked of me? Wasn't that the right thing to do? This, I assume, is not only a conundrum for me. I imagine you have struggled with that same concept. Did you give and know that you could have enabled a vice? Or just give? Or do you just buy food and necessities for those who ask, for the homeless, and those struggling to make ends meet? The reality of the problem is not that easy to assess. But the financial problems in the US and around the world are increasing. So the question at large for our church is, how do we manage our finances for the least of these?
Yeah, I think that finances can play a role. They are resources that we have for doing good in our communities. So we should be, as a church, constantly asking ourselves the question, how do we get more of our resources on the ground in our local communities rather than in offices in some distant place? That should be a constant question that our church is wrestling with. I guess part of the model of how the church works is that the redistribution model is simply that makes resources available to other parts of the church that might not be able to afford them. So there is a sense in which there is something good happening there. And the more I've been involved in the work of justice the more I've actually come to appreciate the church structure with the potential that it has to do good, with the potential that it has to do justice in its communities and even on national levels. Because if we actually get all these institutions, all these different levels and parts of the church working for the good of the community, for the good of the society, we actually then have multifaceted ways of responding. There's a local church that I've been a little bit involved with that has been doing some really good things with refugees from places such as Iran and Syria and some of those troubled parts of the world that have come to Australia in difficult circumstances. And they've often connected first with a community centre that has offered English language programs, for example. And then there's been a connection to a local church, and then there's been opportunities where once people have got to know them, that they've sponsored children of the refugees to actually go to the local Adventist school, and then some of them have got jobs in the local aged care centre. And so you start to see this whole network of institutions that the church has that actually together, and when they actually exist for the good of the community rather than just ourselves, they become a very powerful network of support and infrastructure of justice. And so I think we need to change our attitude to why these things exist, and to recognize that they exist for the good of other people more than they exist for ourselves. And when we do that, we refocus on the community, and then we'll seek out those most in need in the community. I also think that because of our infrastructure, and I've had these kind of conversations with high-level Christian justice advocates, and they look at the Adventist Church and say, well, when you look at the infrastructure that the Adventist system has, if that could be a collective voice for justice, it would be a powerful thing in the world. And I go, yes, if only it was. And I'm more enthusiastic about the potential for the church than I ever have been, but we do need to change our attitudes. And then that will have other flow-on effects in how we structure, how we use and distribute finances and some of these things. But the first thing we need to do is simply to hear this call, the biblical call to do justice.
And while that is a very important part, the financial part, the contributions that we give and where we direct our money, is that all? Is that the only demonstration that we have to go and support justice? To clamor against injustice? Is it okay to march, to show support, to do something radical, per se?
Yeah, well, I think there is a time and a place to march down a street near you. There are things where that is a way to get an effective way to get attention for an issue and to speak. And when you get a collective group of people that are speaking for something like that, it shows it can show the level of concern that might be in society about a particular issue. If it's something that we're passionate about, I think that there are some, it is something that we shouldn't necessarily shy away from. I think we have a strong prophetic heritage in even who we are as Adventists that says, hey, the systems of this world are broken or fallen or however we want to describe them. And there are people who stand up against that, and we should be prepared to, stand with them, to be identified as a part of that from time to time and when it's appropriate. Now, I certainly think that we should be non-violent, and that's a science in itself. How do you make an impact? How do you confront in non-violent ways? How do you disrupt something that is unjust, but in a way that continues to be true to who you are and what you believe? So, these things need to be studied and thought about, and there's a lot of complexity to them at times, but that shouldn't be an excuse to do nothing. And there certainly are other ways that are perhaps less confrontational, less, an entry point perhaps, if someone isn't ready to start marching down the street. Certainly letter writing it can be an effective way to get the attention of elected officials on a particular issue. But we also need to think about, well, one voice is valuable, but could we organise a group of people to write letters, or perhaps even a church board if there's an issue in that particular community, when did a church board or business meeting last say, okay, let's write to our, local council, local authority, our county officials, our elected representatives and say, well, this is something that is a concern to us as a church, and we've prioritized this as a church, and our church can have a very strong collective voice in some of these kind of discussions, because there are things that we should have perspectives about, that we should feel that we can speak on. And, churches, schools, our church institutions can be actually very powerful because they represent a much larger body of people. And so when our voice is used for good, our voice can be amplified in that way.
We'll be right back to talk about how to use that voice even in political environments. Thank you for listening to Disruptive Adventism. We'll see you after the break. You have an idea. You want to tell it to the world, but you don't know where to start. That's where Anchor comes in. They have the tools for you to edit, produce, and record your idea right from your phone or computer. It's the easiest way to reach and grow your audience. They publish for you to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all major platforms. And to top it all off, they match you with advertisers so you can earn from your passion and your wonderful idea. So tell me, what are you waiting for? Download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started and follow your dream. We hope that you're enjoying this episode. And before we get to the final words, let me talk about Chipotle one more time. At the beginning of the episode, I told you about the battle for best Mexican restaurant. The battle is fierce. It feels like politics sometimes. Some say that Moe's is way better than Chipotle. Other people swear their lives and money on Qdoba or Taco Bell. They say that they have a better taste than Chipotle. They're advocates, lobbyists, and even social media groups that dedicate to this debate. You can search Reddit for that. On the Christian front, however, it can be a little bit of a muddy terrain, a fine line of sorts. How do we navigate in the middle of this separation of church and state? How do we get into the politics of all? Do we leave politics aside and not intervene among the systems set to perpetrate injustice? Is it a fine line? How can we be effective and use our voice to help others?
Yeah, I'm not sure it is a fine line, and I don't think we actually need to separate those things. I think that when we say that we can't get involved in speaking for justice because that's political, we're actually making an idol out of politics. We're saying that politics is more important to us, and our, trying to stay pure from it is more important to us than the call to follow God. And that's kind of getting things the wrong way around, which is idolatry. We're making politics more important than the very explicit and direct call of God to speak up on behalf of those whose voices aren't heard. So that's my first thing. The other thing is that everything we do is political. Our silence is just as political as our speech. And so when we are silent in the face of injustice, in the face of outrages, in the face of people being ignored, oppressed, exploited, or abused, then we are being political because our silence is always on the side of the oppressors. So the more just way is to speak. Now, we need to learn how to do that well, and that's where we start getting, we can be drawn into the messiness of politics. That's inevitable. We live in the world. There is no pure place to stand in the world, and we are never called to simply step back and leave the world to its own devices. We're always called to be a voice while ever we have a voice. So I just reject that premise that we shouldn't be involved in politics, because we are involved in politics. And if we choose to say nothing, that's a political statement in and of itself, and we need to recognize that. So the question is not whether we're involved in politics, it's how we're involved in politics, and whether we're involved in it for the good or for the ill, when it comes down as simple as that. There's no neutral place to stand in some of these situations. That doesn't mean that there's a perfect place to stand. the world is a messy and complicated business, and that's why we need to learn how to do it better. We need to be informed about issues. We need to think about solutions. We need to listen to people with different opinions. We need to get involved in the conversations in our society, because that's where the opportunities will come to speak positively and to speak for good and to speak for the least of these. But I do think one of the things that's really helped my understanding on this question is a distinction that Greg Boyd makes in his book, The Myth of a Christian Nation, where he simply says that there's a pretty significant difference in exercising power over compared to power under. And our call is always to be a voice for the least of these, so our calling is to be a power under, to lift people up and to make sure voices that aren't being heard are being heard, or at least have an opportunity to be heard. And that's very different to being a power over and seeking to impose our morality, our worldview, whatever it might be, on others. So that's where I think that's been a really helpful in my understanding of where we fit in these discussions.
As we have listened to Nathan during this episode, our calling is to help others, to help the voice of the least of these. If you read the quarterly during these 3 months, any of them, I think you have noticed that everything points towards advancing the cause of the poor, the widows, those who are disadvantaged, and even those who are oblivious to the power of sin in their lives. I hope that this episode and these final words by Nathan help motivate your life to serve and not be served.
One of the things that when I was working in the context of some of the opportunities I've had to speak on these topics over the last little while has been the context of the Sabbath School quarterly, which I was involved in writing and researching with ADRA first in Australia and then ADRA International. And, in the current quarter, the focus is studying some of these verses through the Bible. And one of the things that caught my attention, and I kind of had my mind on as I was researching and writing this, and as I've been involved with it in the years in between, is simply, imagine if there's somebody somewhere that is fed or is helped in their local community because our church around the world is spending time focusing on this, and that this has practical implications, that somebody responding to this somewhere who I will never see or never hear about will make a difference in somebody else's life because they spent some time reading the Bible in this way. And to me, that's a pretty inspiring and exciting opportunity. The potential of so many people around the world just getting some renewed focus on this topic and this call, I think is very significant. But I've also come to appreciate, and perhaps this a little more recently, this idea that when we talk about justice and God's concern about injustice and poverty in the world, we actually get a bigger picture of God and a better picture of God, a God who hears, who sees, who cares about those who are suffering, those who are most in need, those who are oppressed, and that doesn't lose sight of that, even amidst when injustice can seem overwhelming. And as you can discover then, if you start reading through some of the prophets, that this is actually the way God wants us to worship, is to reach out to others, and to, Isaiah 58, this bigger picture of the fast that I require from you, the worship that I'm looking for, says God, is to care for those in need, is to feed the hungry and set the oppressed free and to loose the chains of oppression. And so it's a little bit of a loop, but the more we understand this, the more we have more and bigger reasons to worship God, and in turn we have more and better reasons to serve others and to speak and to make a difference in our world.
You've been listening to Disruptive Adventism. We hope that today's topic helped you to think and change something about your practices, about your faith, about your Adventism. If you want to subscribe, make sure to go to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcast. We'll be there. And make sure to give us a review if you like what you're listening to. If you want to support, make sure to go to patreon.com/disruptiveadventism. It helps us pay our bills and produce the content that you're listening to. And if you want to socialize, make sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram or on Twitter, and hit us up whenever you need anything. We'll be there to support you. Thank you for listening today. We hope you join us next time. And as always, we invite you to be disruptive.